There's the echo I was looking for. Welcome everyone. I would like to begin with heartfelt thanks to Kathy Davidson, the team at HASTAC, the Franklin Humanities Institute, John Hope Franklin Center for hosting us and making this event possible. It's an absolute pleasure to be on the dais today with scholars whose work has made my work possible. And all I have to say right now, after just hearing the oral performance of the papers, is wow. Just wow, and thank you very much. I also want to extend a warm welcome and appreciation to the folks listening in the cyber universe. Thank you for coming out today, no pun intended. The title of my response today is Telling Tales Out of School. The Urban Dictionary defines telling tales out of school as telling secrets or spreading rumors or gossip. Interesting. Poised between secret and rumor, these narratives belie the dirt that they always already spring from, while doing a significant amount of gendering in the meantime. And I think I'm riffing off of all the papers here in terms of the dirt. Gossip Boy just wouldn't be as compelling as Gossip Girl. Right? This symposium exists in that space of the everyday. And what better place to begin my reflections here than with the Academy, where many of us spend at least 60% of our working time. And I'm fudging that percentage, by the way. In many ways, our quotidian lives in the Academy are built upon the flux between quiet as it's kept and those moments when gossip becomes fact, and then again fiction. Being a public intellectual might get you in front of the public. But in many ways, our life stories don't reach beyond the Academy because they are not the subject of true and open discussion amongst us. I will start here with a tale about school being told out of school. September 2011. In a committee meeting with scholars of color in the last year, we were discussing various strategies at work in the institution that might make it possible for people of color to survive the halls of academia. We focused on the usual topics: mentoring or lack thereof, support for non-traditional and innovative research, joint appointments which often carry with them a more than 100% burden regardless of the fine print, family structures that leave women and people of color, especially in this economic climate, taking care of more than one household while juggling a career trajectory that is daunting if the statistics are at all correct. In attendance was a white man who performed the role of representative for the association during our meetings, often answering pertinent questions about policy and institutional history. During this discussion, he left the room for coffee, and our co-chair seized upon the opportunity to avoid telling tales out of school by asking, how are we going to deal with something that is a given in the places where we all work? That most often the visible impediment to our advancement in the institution is someone who shares our identity, someone who looks like us, sleeps like us, and or marks their sex in the same way. And I'm reminded here of Angel Hayes's marking the space of her relationship with Michelle Obama as precisely that resistance to that inside-outside solidarity narrative, right? And I just want to bring that resistance home. Of course, now I lost my place. Nods and murmurs of acquiescence echoed around the table, and then a collective sigh of resignation. Our faces clouded with the memories of all the institutions we have labored in and left, and the students we have served, nurtured, and sometimes sheltered from that aspect of our experience. The work that we do often comes at great cost, and we sometimes forget that this labor has this historical precedence. The work of truly integrating the institution continues, and it does require a fair amount of disagreement, argument, and sometimes quotidian and spectacular violence. The general constituency in this room speaks volumes about that work. We are not here together in this place because everyone around us at some time thought it was a good idea for us to be here. Nobody looked up and said, that would be all kinds of awesome. But I digress. That moment in that September meeting was just a blip in time in a very long day. Our minder returned. We closed ranks. We went about the business of getting our business concluded. Our focus no longer on our own thoughts, but haunted by them nonetheless. How do you tell tales out of school and get away with it? Such tales are told in fiction all the time. We only have to look at the creative work of Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Toni Cade Bambara, Gail Jones, Leslie Marmon Silko, and others in the 20th century, and the responses to their work, right? To give us a sense of the stakes here. But where is the public narrative of quotidian homophobia, racism, and the institutions, the boundaries of which mark our movement from home to class, to meeting, to home again? What happens when you break ranks, depart from the common narrative, or attempt to bring to light what might otherwise go unremarked upon, which is exactly what we've experienced here today with all three papers? In many ways, the work I do in the erotic life of racism is subtended by this question, as it attempts to translate conversations in conference hallways, elevators, and yes, restrooms, speaking of the bottom, into the work of theory. I attempt to name what cannot or should not be articulated for the sake of creating greater dialogues like this one. Each and every one of the scholars on the dais with me today have marked such territory in their own work, and I am honored to have such distinguished company in the collective project of asking somewhat thorny, uncomfortable, and at times outrageous questions. The central argument in my book rests not upon a reading of fiction, but instead upon articulations of our critical communities, and how maneuvers among theoretical homes like critical race, feminist, and queer theory produce what David Thiel Goldberg calls racist effects. Effects which are not always readily understood in the same way, because, to paraphrase Derrida here for a moment, racism and apartheid are always out there somewhere, never in here where we live, breathe, and create institutional space, theoretical communities, etc., etc., etc. While my book might not be the best theoretical location for those of us wanting to critique traditional structures of institutional racism and homophobia, it was and is my goal for us to take another look at the everyday, to mark what our theoretical work has produced, and to think about how the upshot of theoretical engagement can manifest itself in a great loss. In essence, we usually agree when it comes to spectacular forms of racism and homophobia that what we are seeing is always already the thing itself. Not so easy when the tables turn to that everyday faculty meeting or university-wide forum. Yet our fiction marks for us the everyday hazards of the inside, being truly at the bottom while being on top, and being ejected from the biological fold in often violent ways, something that Marlon's paper really touches upon. Think Sula and Seka, Rosa and Dewey Dell, Ida B. Wells and Harriet Jacobs, Precious and Pearline, Angel Hayes and Mickey Blanco. In many ways, the scholars assembled here have marked those spaces where the confluence of sex and racial being produce an uncomfortable effect, have noted the thing that we want to turn away from. In this vein, no one excavates a text like Catherine von Stockton. In her examination of Sula, she notes that Morrison, quote, directly tests the extent to which blacks, before civil rights, could afford any forms of pleasurable loss, could afford a kind of bottom theology, a kind of celebration of divine debasement. Reaching bottom is theologically encouraged, sexually pleasurable, but economically dangerous for marginalized peoples, end quote. Such musings demonstrate how, when we really think race and racism and all of its implications, we do arrive at a very queer place. And as Stockton offers, a very queer vision of categories like masculine and feminine, black and white. Her attempt to understand, quote, the bottom is something more than an economic cellar, end quote, redirects our attention from an absolutely denigrated blackness to a being capable of experiencing pleasure, and I would add, capable of meting out pain. For crossing the line between the two, guiding us back to and through another vision of the self, of home, of community. Stockton's take on redemption interests me most here. She writes, This is the orthodox view of redemption. It is often a violent non-equivalence between two different actions at two different times inside one sign. One form of violence pays the price for prior violence. Layer them, add them, you have redemption. Redemption is all about additions at the scene of the violence of signs, end quote. The discourse of redemption is firmly embedded in the place where black and white intersect. And the punitive nature of the conversation makes crossing virtually impossible, really. Redemption is a bankrupt ideology, following Stockton here, as it produces a rehearsed hierarchy between black and white, while simultaneously obfuscating pleasure and pain at precisely the moment where their interplay becomes integral to our understanding of the disorder of all things racial. And where she ends is at the intersection of the sexual child and the sign that cannot hold a signifier. And I too am working on a monograph, Little Black Girl, and I look forward to a kind of fruitful conversation about how to think about the ways in which the black girl is figured and not. I love Marlon Ross's use of the term poor parent, a word that links biological belonging to the space of the political, to a politic or politics, a space once characterized by Derrida again as one that supposes livestock, as the political represents the human's just inclination toward proper management. And I'm thinking here about Jefferson and his breeding and his horses and his dogs, right? Inspired by Catherine and perhaps Derrida too, I cannot help but think about foreskin here, which has only one definition, maybe thankfully. Protection of the penis, which modern day living must excise for proper use and sanitary enjoyment. And I'm thinking here about that image of the hooded black man. For now, I want to move to another moment in Marlon's paper where he creates ties among black political struggles and the bodies of queer black people who either do or do not see themselves as participants in what is constituted as the political. He observes that the quote, unquote, cinematic pastiche that is Marlon Reed's film, Tongues and Tide, and I quote here again, is scripted through a romance of familiarity, evidenced in the black vernacular phrase in the family or one of the children that is served as insider euphemism, secretly identifying same gender-loving black persons for at least several generations. If the black race is blood kin, then exclusion and estrangement from that natural family become all the more difficult to justify and enact, at least theoretically, end quote. Ross lands in the middle of a quotidian conundrum. As black belonging and difference are marked by the biological drawing, our attention to the impossibility of being excised from a space, to paraphrase Toni Morrison, seething with our presence. At each and every step, Ross worries the political and the politics of what he terms crude analogy, one that sutures black community to itself, thus creating others from the inside and out, and one that scripts this thing which is not one, to borrow from Irigaray, as yoked to belonging in black and white, a racial belonging that requires erotic charge to bring the analogy home. Jack Halberstam's paper more explicitly engages the major and minor arguments of my book, and the trajectory through to an anarchist text is fully in line with where my response begins and where it now ends. First, I want to begin with the cutting that opens his work, because these violent intrusions upon the scene of whiteness mark a profound auditory silence in the work of making blackness coherent. And I put a question mark beside whiteness there, because I always want to question whether, in a sense, that thing is unitary entity. As Halberstam notes, and I quote here, black figuration in Walker's paper sculptures emerges literally from cuts made into the fabric of whiteness, and whiteness is all that remains when blackness has been excised, end quote. That boundary between blackness and whiteness cuts both ways, suturing neatly here, severing dangerously there. This dual and contradictory world-making project perhaps explains my beginnings here, as we tend to read the cutting in only one direction, one that usually leads to the discourses of freedom and solidarity that do not always hold the truth of our everyday experience. That experience is messier, and to think through the work of Saidiya Hartman here, perhaps more terror than pleasure. In thinking through quotidian moods and using my own experiences and that of others through the undercurrents of secrets and lies, I attempt to take a look when we would rather look away. But to the larger critique here, I want to situate my inquiry not as a process of alignments, but as a process of misalignment, one that does not always bring about solidarity, but which might create what my friends in my group dynamics meeting each week would call intimacy. That place of misunderstanding, of overstanding, if you will, can be fruitful, as our responses to it produce more thoughtful and engaged theorizing, produce a certain kind of Nietzschean return, maybe. We're always in that waiting for Godot moment. I want to return to that moment of the gestural that Jack invokes by way of Joseph Roach's work. In Mark Anthony Neal's interview with Charlotte Amons on Left of Black, she speaks to a desire to change the terms of our engagement with hip-hop through its economy of gestures, many of them masculinist, as Jack so eloquently tracks and marks. One of the ways to change the gendered lexicon of our political life would be, I offer, to think through our investments in familiar tropes. One in particular would be Black feminism itself. In restoring diversity to the plane of Black feminist inquiry, I hope to fashion another theoretical gesture by questioning the very quotidian moves we make in order to bring a rather utilitarian purposefulness to her voice, her presence. And then, I want us to lose Black feminism altogether. To let go the monolithic narrative for the charged space of fungible disagreement. It is this moment, I ultimately argue, that might pave the way for difference to finally make its mark. Cara Keeling once offered in a conversation that we should agree to disagree more often. And I think she is entirely right about that. What I want ELR, the Erotic Life of Racism, to inspire is exactly the kind of conversation we are having today. One in which the diversity of opinion and the kind of unhinged theorizing we have seen from everyone, that is theorizing dancing, full, out, no holes barred, going to the territory, is on full display and embraced. I will end here with a paraphrasing of the book's penultimate paragraph. On the staircase, think Flighty and Rosa's touch are in the departmental meeting or at the ballot box as we've seen lately. We mark the time-space continuum of our belonging. People come and go on that same causeway where this presentation began. It is time to write a new chapter of our relations, where the dangerous work of the everyday has some transformative, and the question mark here, phenomenal, agency. The Erotic Life of Racism is just one attempt to remember what quotidian moves we must make in order to contain our racial feeling, and how the work of racism is important to that practice. To reiterate the words of one punk band, I love to go out on music, you can't be what you were, so you better start being just what you are. Let me rephrase that. You can't be what you were, so you better start being just what you are. Thank you.
Good afternoon, folks.